Welcome back, everybody. This is another Conversations on Anarres. I'm Dr. Joseph Orosco. I'm a professor of philosophy at Oregon State University, and I'm the co-director of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures at Oregon State. The Anarres Project is a forum for conversations, projects, and initiatives that try to imagine a future free of oppression, exploitation, domination, war, and empire. And one of the projects that we maintain is this, our Conversations on Anarres. I have a very special guest today that I'm excited to speak with. My guest is Dr. Eric Schwitzgebel. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of California, Riverside. He's the author previously of Perplexities of Consciousness from MIT Press, does a lot of work in philosophy of mind and consciousness. And he's most well known to most people for his popular blog, The Splintered Mind, in which he has a lot of very short, accessible essays on philosophical topics. He's now the co-editor of a new book, which is what we're going to hopefully talk about today, called Philosophy Through Science Fiction Stories, Exploring the Boundaries of the Possible. And that's from Bloomsbury Press. It was just issued now in January 2021. And so welcome, Eric. I'm excited that you're here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Um, I'm excited to sort of explore this this new book with you. One of the things that we try to do here at the Anarres Project is, inspired by the work of Ursula K. Le Guin, try to imagine different ways in which we can think about changes in culture, politics, and society in general through imaginative works from science fiction. And so I'm excited to see how you think that we can learn about philosophy through science fiction stories. But before we get to your book, I wanted to ask you some personal questions, because I know that, for almost 10 years now, you've been blogging on your blog, The Splintered Mind, and you've been thinking about doing philosophical thinking through science fiction. You've collected various philosophical science fiction works on your blog to sort of share with readers. So I wanted to ask you personally, what got you interested in science fiction? How did you become a fan? And when you think about science fiction, are there particular universes in literature, movies, or television that you're particularly partial to?
Yeah, well, I was a nerdy teenager back in the 80s, and I loved science fiction in at that time of my life for the same broad kinds of reasons that lots of nerdy teenagers in the 80s love science fiction. I loved a lot of the same stuff that lots of the others of that era liked. I liked Asimov and Heinlein and that kind of thing. I was a early discoverer of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy back
Oh,
when it was
right.
a radio show.
Great. Yeah, yeah,
Wow, this
yeah.
amazing radio show! I can't believe it. That was when I was in middle school. So I was very interested in science fiction in that era, and then I kind of lost when I got to college. I kind of lost touch with it a bit until, and then I continued in grad school. Although I watched every episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation. That was my one like kind of thread of science fiction through grad school,
Right.
and then I kind of lost touch with it until it was probably around 2008,
Hmm.
2007. Someone said, "Hey, there's this interesting book by Greg Egan called Diaspora. I bet you'd like it." And I read it, and it just blew my mind. I had not had an appreciation of the possibility of science fiction to explore the kinds of issues about consciousness and intelligence
Mm.
that were not really so visible in the most of the 80s era stuff, right? Especially like Heinlein. He's great in lots of ways, right? And he does have some stuff about artificial intelligence in there, especially Moon is a Heart's Mistress or whatever, but it
Right,
wasn't
right.
it wasn't primarily about that. A lot of it was soldiers and
Yeah.
soldiers and rockets kind of stuff, right? Which is fun and wonderful. But just when I read the Egan, it just revealed to me in a way I hadn't before, as now a professor of philosophy, the amazing philosophical potential that especially the stuff flowing out of the cyberpunk movement and then
Mm.
later
Right.
the amazing philosophical potential of that work to explore the nature of human consciousness, the meaning of life. in directions that I hadn't appreciated. So that just lit my candle about, I got to read a lot more of this stuff. So that's when I got really excited about it. Again, I started reading it. I started occasionally publishing short pieces of science fiction on my blog,
Uh-huh.
because I already had an established blog at that point. So I started doing little science fictional style reflections on my blog, and that eventually got me into writing my own science fiction stories. So that's kind of how it worked for me.
What do you think it is about science fiction itself? I mean, we'll talk a little bit about this when we talk about your book, but what is it that, for you at least, made science fiction something interesting for you to be able to explore philosophical themes through it?
I like the richness of imagination, the depth of imagination,
Mm,
right? It's one thing to say, oh, well, people could become, if you have a certain kind of philosophical view about the mind, they could become robots or pieces of artificial intelligence instantiated through software. It's one thing to say that abstractly, right? As some philosophers have said, coming out of the cognitive science tradition in the 70s and 80s, right? It's another thing to really think through, oh, what would be the consequences of that,
right,
right? So, like Egan, right? Well, if you were a piece of software, then you could back yourself up. You could make
right,
duplicates of yourself.
right,
You could change the parameters of what you're interested in, right? He's got this concept of an exoself, right? So you can kind of have some bracket around yourself that says, well, I think I'd like to be more interested in this and less interested in that, or whatever,
yeah,
right? And
yeah,
to think through, well, what would really be the consequences? What would really flow out of something like that? That's something that science fiction does in a way that expository philosophy rarely can do in the same kind of engaging detail.
right, right. Well, let's talk a little bit about this way of thinking about uh, science fiction in a philosophical mode. So there's some arguments have been made about the way in which philosophy can take up science fiction, and some have argued that there's at least two relationships that science fiction can have to philosophical work. So one sort of mode or way is that science fiction can be used to illustrate philosophical problems. So it can be a pedagogical tool, right? And so I know a lot of philosophers who will use Star Trek or Star Wars. We've talked with other people before in our interviews about the ways in which they use these universes to illustrate particular sort of philosophical problems. But it's less sort of exploring philosophical problems presented within it, but as examples or as kind of exciting illustrative ways so that students can get into understanding the dimensions of a philosophical issue. The other sort of view about science fiction is that science fiction narratives actually make cases, that they actually advance philosophical positions. They take sort of stances. And in this way, for instance, Star Trek often presents a certain kind of particular vision about the future, and it says that certain kinds of social problems need to be advanced in order to be arriving at a utopian future. So it makes certain kinds of claims about how the world ought to be. So there are these two ways, right? One, that the science fiction can be used as an illustration of other philosophical problems. It's sort of secondary to the problems itself, or that there are philosophical problems or positions that science fiction stories put forth for consideration. Um, what do you think is the best way to think about the relationship of philosophy to science fiction stories?
I much prefer the second way.
Uh-huh.
There's something about, I mean, pedagogy is great. I'm a pedagogue. I'm a teacher, right? So, of course you have to, there's nothing wrong with pedagogy, but there's something in that vision of it that rubs me a little bit the wrong way, for two reasons. One is it puts you as a teacher in a position of intellectual authority over the person you're teaching to. And sometimes that's appropriate, but there's part of me that wants to resist going too far in that direction. And the other thing that I don't really care that much for in that vision is the idea that science fiction, it's a kind of view of science fiction as not itself directly a way of doing philosophy, but just a way of simplifying or uh, communicating ideas that are really more properly arrived at through some other means. So those two dimensions of pedagogy demean science fiction and the intended audience slightly, in a way that I don't like.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, because this is the thing I find mostly whenever I'm talking to philosophy professors, and I talk to them about my interest, for instance, in sci-fi and Star Trek. They go, "Oh yeah, I'm interested in that too." I always show that one Star Trek: The Next Generation episode, the Measure of a Man. I always show that to talk about personhood or something or other. And I
Right.
was like, "Oh, that's great." And if I ask them, "Well, what else do you talk about with science fiction?" They go, "Oh, that's it." And they use it as an illustration, and so that's
Right.
interesting. But so, what about the idea of science fiction as posing philosophy, or of doing philosophy? What is it that you like about that position?
Uh, I do like that position. I'm going to answer that question in just a second, but I want to respond to part of the way you characterize the second position, philosophy, and expand what you said a little bit. Um, so I'm not going to recall exactly the way you phrased it, but one of the things you'd said is it can be a way of advancing philosophical positions. And I think that can be true, but that way of phrasing it invites the idea that philosophy is about advancing positions. And I think philosophy isn't always about that. It can also be about exploring positions without necessarily advancing them, right? And it can be about creating wonder and doubt, right? So these are other things that can happen in philosophy besides advancing positions. And if your primary goal really is advancing a position, then maybe the expository essay is often your best tool for that, unless you're going for a pedagogical gain,
Mm,
right? Whereas I think part of what science fiction often does better than expository philosophy is these other aspects of creating doubt, creating wonder, exploring positions without necessarily committing to exactly where the truth lies. Um, so yeah, so I want to.
mm,
So these are all ways of actively doing philosophy,
right,
right?
right.
So I just wanted to expand that second part of the vision a little bit in that
Yeah, good point. Yeah, fair enough.
way. So here's one of the ways I think about science fiction as philosophy. Um, so I think one thing we can do when we think about philosophy is we can imagine philosophy as involving a spectrum. From, on the one end, you have very abstractly put positions, like do the thing that maximizes overall happiness. Super abstract, right? On the other end, you can have a fully developed imaginative fiction. And in the middle, you can have things like the philosopher's thought experiment, right? Of course, the one of the most famous ones being the trolley problem. Probably a lot of your listeners are familiar with it, but for those of you who aren't, right, this is just a famous, much discussed thought experiment in which there's a runaway trolley or boxcar or whatever, right? It's going to kill 5 people if you do nothing. You can flip a lever, divert it into a sidetrack where it will kill one person, right? Should you flip the lever and save the one person, right? And then there's another version of it where you're standing on a footbridge next to either a heavy person or a hiker with a heavy backpack. It's the same runaway trolley. It's going to kill 5 people if you do nothing. You can push the hiker with the heavy backpack right in front of the trolley. It will grind to a halt on his dead body, right? Should you push the hiker, right? A lot of people have different feelings about the two scenarios. I think it's fine to, in fact, maybe even morally required to flip the switch, but they're like pushing the hiker. They're not so sure about that, right? So that's a fascinating kind of paragraph or 2 paragraph long thought experiment. And philosophers use those kinds of things all the time. They don't only talk in abstract theories, right? So you could think of, but then you can think, okay, well, what do you gain by doing the thought experiment? Why do philosophers not just talk, in terms of completely abstract stuff? Why do they need to? Is it just dressing it up for pedagogical purposes or something, or is there something really cognitively that's being done by engaging the imagination in this more developed mini fiction? And I think there is something that's being done, right? What happens when you have these more fully developed thought experiments is that you're engaging different parts of the human mind. Right? The human mind is bad, really bad at abstract thinking. Think how long it took you as an elementary school student to memorize the multiplication tables. That was like they're not that big. Right? And
Right,
it takes you
right.
years to figure them out. And people still struggle a little bit sometimes, like, oh, 6 times 8, y'all right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? Or think about, if you know anything about formal logic, think about the trouble people have with modus ponens, modus tollens, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Just simple puzzles in formal logic that you could model with, say, a 2-bit operation. I used to write questions for the law school admissions test. I
Mm.
had a formula for writing a really killer critical reasoning question, which was I give people a paragraph about something about which they had no intuitions, like interest rates in Ecuador and which political party is more likely to win the election. I give them some stuff
Wow.
about that, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then I'd give them 5 options, and they all would involve an if-then statement and a negation in ordinary language. And the options would be things like, unless interest rates go down, party B is unlikely to win. Party B is likely to win only if interest rates don't go up, right? And I'd give like 5 like that, and like I'd have written the thing, and at the end I'm like, wait, now like, how do you put together an if-then with a negation in ordinary language? It's like, for a professional philosopher who freaking wrote the problem, it's hard. This is how bad we are at like
Yeah, yeah.
super abstract stuff, right? So on the other hand, what are we great at? We're great at things like detecting when someone's making a sly insult in a social situation
Yeah.
through an
Yeah.
indirect act of speech. I mean, that is so much cognitively more demanding at some kind of information processing level, right? How much do you need to know about the social context and all these kinds of things to take an indirect speech act as a kind of insult? We're great at emotional cognition, social cognition, imagination, right? So if you're trying to do philosophy just in terms of the abstract stuff, you are not engaging the human mind where it's
Hmm.
strong,
Hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
To really kind of think about some abstract proposition like, does it make sense to do what overall maximizes happiness? You got to start thinking socially, imaginatively, right? You
Right.
engage those part of, even if it's just abstract, you do the fictions yourself,
Right.
right? So the more you engage in this kind of fictional style thinking, the more you're getting traction on problems with the part of our mind that really works well.
Right.
Now there are risks in that too. There are risks in it too, because one of the nice things about the super abstract stuff is that you peel away all the irrelevant things, or things you think are irrelevant at least,
Mm-hmm.
right? Whereas, say, let's say you do, just to use another example with the trolley problem, right? So there's at least some evidence that if you give the person on the footbridge a stereotypically rich person's name, like
Oh.
I don't know, Thurston Thorncraft the Third,
Right. Right.
uh, and you do another version where they have a stereotypically black name, you know, like Tyrone Jackson.
Yeah.
Liberals would be more likely to push the aristocrat, less likely to push the black person, and conservatives the other way around. There's some evidence for
Really?
that, right?
Really? Wow.
So, right, and this totally makes sense. You tell a fiction, and you're talking about you're inviting people to share a certain kind of worldview, but you know how much they embrace that worldview might partly depend on, do they like the, is the protagonist funny? Can
Yeah.
they relate to the protagonists at the level of race and culture and stuff like that? And you know, if they don't like the protagonist for whatever reason, they may be less likely to like the worldview. And so there's all this other kind of stuff that can get tangled up. Some of that stuff really might turn out matters. Some of it doesn't matter. But I think the way that I like to think about philosophy ultimately here is that there are epistemic advantages to these purified abstract statements, and
Mm.
there are epistemic advantages to fully imagined, emotionally engaging social fictions. And what, as a philosopher, you need to do, or you should do, or at least we as a field as a whole should do, is take advantage of all of those means of thinking about philosophical issues and integrate them.
Well, this raises a really interesting question. I wasn't aware of that particular kind of research with the trolley problem. But So I wonder, you were saying about like the difference between these kinds of emotionally rich sorts of ways of approaching philosophy through metaphor, and then the sort of more abstract, propositional kinds of ways of thinking about doing philosophy. Um, if you think about the history, at least of Western philosophy, there's so much kind of imaginative metaphor that's used uh, in classical philosophy, right? So if we're thinking, for instance, thinking about like um, the way that Plato often, I mean, of course, Plato writing, these dialogues, right? And so it already has a kind of dramatic narrative format to them, but particularly, for instance, using the Republic as a way to articulate various notions of justice, right? Justice gets sort of explained, and you ultimately get to the theory of the forms, but through a very long sort of story of interactions and rich metaphors and visions of possible societies. You can also think, for instance, of the way in which, right, one of the third version of the categorical imperative for Kant, right, is to invites the person to imagine themselves as the universal legislator in the ideal society, right? There's also the way Rawls invites us to start thinking about conditions of justice as fairness by imagining society from an unoriginal position behind the veil of ignorance, right? And so there's a lot of sort of mainstream classical philosophy that invites us to activate our emotional or imaginative capacities, at least, in order to arrive at uh, theories of justice or of morality or of the moral position. Um, I wonder whether you think that this kind of imaginative work and imaginative training is something that good philosophers should be interested in. Can philosophical work be improved through imaginative training, through, for instance, training in understanding how science fiction works?
Yeah, I'm not so sure about the word training. Let me put a little asterisk on that, um, because I think I might go for something a little stronger than training, right? That these imaginative exercises constitute doing philosophy, right? They're not. It's not merely training you to do philosophy. It is itself philosophy,
Okay, I like that. I like that. Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, you know, and maybe there's also a training aspect to it. I have to think about that a little bit. I think my view about that's going to be a little complex. But yeah, let me just go for the stronger version and say the imaginative stuff is not some secondary thing that kind of teaches you or trains you or is an additional bonus. But in fact, it is the very substance of it. So take Kant on the categorical imperative, right? Kant says, act on that maxim you can at the same time will to be a universal law, right? So this is the universal legislative thing, right? What the heck does that mean?
Mm,
Right?
right.
Like people will spend years trying to figure out what that means. Well, I don't think it means anything by itself. I think it means a little bit, right? But I think the real meat of it is through the imaginative examples, right? So it's easy to give a slogan. It's easy to say something like, all men are created equal. In the United States, we love this slogan, right?
Hmm.
It's easy to say, act on that maxim, you can at the same time will to be a universal law. It's easy to say that. Well, so now, okay, say, okay, Thomas Jefferson, like, give me some examples. What do you mean when you say all men are created equal? Do you mean that black people should have the right to vote? Do you mean that people who aren't property owners should have the right to vote? Do you mean that there should be no hereditary titles? Do you mean that there should be, trial by jury? I mean, what does he mean, right? And then give the examples, walk through the cases, and that's where the substance of a slogan like that really gets filled in. I think it's kind of an empty slogan until you fill it in. So it's not that the imagination is some secondary feature. In fact, I think the imagination is the very core of figuring out what is the philosophical content of a view like Kant's Or
Right.
like the Republic, right? Plato imagines a certain kind of republic. That's the right. Maybe there's some abstract statement too, right? There are various abstract statements, right? But the core of it really is in the imaginative picture of
Mm-hmm.
republic that he develops.
Mm-hmm. 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 Well, I often too. I mean, I think like someone like Mark Johnson has written about metaphor a lot, right, and consciousness, and he says, and you know, he ties this into a lot of stuff with like David Hume's idea of morality, right? Is that morality really is a kind of way of being able to be aware of the emotional reactions of others, to be able to sympathize, right? So that part of, right, what it means to be a moral person under this kind of human picture is to be able to imagine what someone
Mm,
else's life is like, and that you wouldn't be able to really be a moral person under this understanding of metaphor and morality if you didn't have that imaginative capacity to get outside of yourself and to think that something that is potentially different than you is actually like yourself,
right.
and sort of bringing together that space between you and the other in an imaginative extension is really the essence of morality in the Humean sense. And so it seems like
Mhm.
trying to figure out how we activate the imaginative capacity and how we think about that in philosophical work seems to be something that's already there in the canon, so to speak, but perhaps something that's been underappreciated as an
Yeah.
understanding of the kind of work that philosophers do.
It makes me think about Martha Nussbaum too, right? You might be familiar with some of her stuff on this, right? So, right, she thinks that why humanities education is super important, right, including philosophy, but also history and also literature, right, is that it involves central to it really is imagining other forms of life and other people's lives. This is and she thinks that it's to be a good world citizen, you have to have this capacity to understand how things might be for other people to do those kinds of imaginative changes. Yeah. So it's not just ethics narrowly construed, but it's also just having the kind of broad humanistic understanding of the world that's required to be an educated citizen, as Nussbaum develops it.
Yeah, so I like this connection. So there's Nussbaum, there's also folks like Richard Rorty, right? Richard Rorty, of course, famously sort of dropped out of philosophy for a while and decided that what he wanted to do was to teach literature because he had sort of similar ideas like this, is that that there was enough philosophy and enough abstract theory going on. We had already sort of settled those questions. It was really now about expanding people's sort of humanistic awareness of one another, right? And so he goes off to teach literature. But this raises a really interesting question, because when Nussbaum and Rorty are talking about literature, they're talking about sort of literary fiction most of the time, and kind of classical narratives. I'm wondering about science fiction, right? So, science fiction is one form of speculative literature, and there are many other forms. There's the fantasy genre, of course, and I know you're a fan of D&D, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, so you
Yeah,
understand, right? There's the fantasy realm. There's magical realism, popular form in Latin America. There's alternative histories that folks like Philip K. Dick used to love to do. So I wonder whether, are all different kinds of literature alike? Nussbaum and Rorty I don't think ever talk about science fiction. Is there anything
yeah.
special or unique about the relationship of science fiction to philosophy that's different than the way in which literary fiction might relate to philosophy? And related to that too is that, do other forms of speculative literature like fantasy or alternative history do well in terms of thinking about philosophical work as well? So a couple of questions there is like, is literary fiction the same sort of effect or the same sort of way of doing philosophy in the way that speculative philosophy can be done?
Yeah. I especially like the scope of science fiction thinking, and let me tell you why. Right. So, um, part of the way that I distinguish between what's sometimes called literary fiction and science fiction, right, is I think that literary fiction or other, it doesn't have to be especially literary, other kinds of fiction, they stay within the realm of ordinary possibilities, right? The ordinary run of human experience, right? And it could be the ordinary run of human experience in a very different culture from which you learn a lot, or it could be in your own culture, right? And one of the things that I like about science fiction is it's not constrained to the ordinary run of human experience, or you're thinking about possibilities that are outside of the ordinary run of human experience as it has been up to today, at least. Right? So it gives you a broader imaginative palette. And a lot of times philosophical issues turn on distinguishing things that often are not distinguished in the ordinary run of human experience. Um, like thinking about the relationship between being a person and having uh, a one human body that continues for a certain amount of time on Earth, right? You know, science fiction and some philosophy, imaginative philosophy, like Derek Parfit, for example, right, can pull apart kind of what it is to be a thinking thing in the human sense and what it is to be an ordinary embodied thing. And in the ordinary run of human experience, those don't come apart. So it gives you the ability to pull apart some things that don't often come apart, right? And to imagine the future. So I like that the palette, the broader palette that science fiction gives you there. I think speculative fiction, of course, gives you an even broader palette, right? So if you think about incorporating magic, there are lots of other things, right? Uh, but but there's a discipline to science fiction. I mean, not science fiction isn't always disciplined in this way, right? And there's different degrees of this discipline, and the boundaries are gray.
Yeah, yeah.
But science fiction is disciplined in a certain way, in principle, that it's got to be some sort of possible thing that could happen, some kind of thing that is technologically feasible in some way, right? So you're within the realm of kind of not normal human experience as it's existed so far, but at least plausible, possible human experience.
Right, at least a sort
Or,
of projected view of
right,
what a future might be given scientific laws
right,
that we
right,
understand. Yeah.
right, and that disciplines you in a certain way, um, which restricts some of the stuff that say fantasy can engage in. So fantasy has some tools that science fiction doesn't have.
Hmm.
Um, but at the same time, I think there is something valuable about this category of being willing to go beyond the ordinary run of human experience and yet trying to stay within the run of possible, feasible experience.
Right, right.
So I like the kind of boundary of science fiction in particular, but I think there's valuable things, you know, across that boundary and under that boundary and all that kind of thing. I mean, I love Borges, for example. He's
Right,
amazing.
right,
One
right.
of maybe my favorite writer ever. I'd love to call him a science fiction author, but you know, it's not exactly science. It's speculative fiction more broadly. He's
Right.
not staying within what's technologically feasible.
Yeah, right, right.
Yeah.
Well, I guess hence actually that sort of gets to the title of your new edited book, right? Philosophy through science fiction, exploring the boundaries of the possible.
Exactly. That
Right.
was the
So,
thought behind that subtitle. Yes.
okay, good, good. Well, could you tell us a little bit about the development of this new book? Where did this idea come from? What are you trying to do with this new book, and what impact do you hope it will make?
Right. So this is co-edited with Helen de Cruz and Johann Smet. And what we wanted to do was two things. We wanted to get some awesome philosophically themed stories from some of our favorite writers, just like to encourage that stuff to happen. And we got some really amazing stories. I'm so happy with the stories in this collection. And about half of the writers are professional science fiction writers, including some amazing award-winning science fiction writers.
Yeah,
Uh,
I saw something I just wanted to say, right? The lineup is great. This is a great collection.
yeah, and about the other half, or four of them, well, four or five if you count a reprint, are philosophers who have track records of publishing fiction, and they really stepped up and also came up with some really great stories. So, and all of the stories have reflections afterwards by the authors, where they expand a little bit on what their thinking was behind the story, what philosophical themes they wanted to engage. And so part of it was to encourage to create those stories, to get those stories out there. And the other thing that we wanted to do with it was to try to build better bridges between the science fiction community and the philosophy community, right? So I think, and I think probably your listeners think, and you think, that there are these amazing connections between science fiction and philosophy. I think science fiction is a way of doing philosophy. But sociologically, there's not much. There are not many people who are straddling the two social groups, right? There are not many people who are both going to Worldcon, right, and presenting there, right, who are editing or writing science fiction, who also are in academic philosophy. So we wanted to also help build some of those bridges and maybe start a little bit on integrating sociologically the two groups of each other.
Do you have any plans yourself to go and present at different Comic Cons and different kinds of? I mean, do you hope to be able to do that personally yourself?
I have done some of that. I've presented at the Nebula conference and at Worldcon. I haven't gone to Comic Con, but yeah, I do that. I intend to continue doing that. I publish some stories of my own also. Um, so yes, I want to be someone who continues to straddle the two communities. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you about your own work in writing fiction. Do you have you've done some of this on your blog you mentioned before. Do you have any hopes to be able to publish any of your own fictional writing this way?
Yes, I've published maybe 10 or 11 short stories. So yeah, I've published them in some of the best regarded science fiction magazines, like Clark's World and Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, Nature. So I've had some success placing my stories in pretty competitive venues. So I'm pretty proud of them, and
That's great.
I'm continuing to do that, and hopefully get enough of them together at some point to have an anthology. Um, and my stories, of course, are all centered on philosophical ideas.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Well, I wonder. So, in thinking about these different worlds sociologically that you mentioned, I wonder whether you've hit any kind of resistance from either world, from the philosophy world or from the sort of science fiction nerd world, in terms of trying to create this bridge. Which world is harder to crack into to get these kinds of discussions going on?
Um, I think both worlds I found to be full of people who like the idea. It might be a minority in both worlds, but I think it's a large minority, right? So definitely, I talk with people who are prominent in science fiction, and they love the idea of connecting with philosophy. They like the philosophy themes in their work. They're flattered that a philosopher, thinks there's important philosophical stuff going on in their work. They love talking about that stuff. They see that as part of their motivation to explore some of these big ideas, right? So, not everybody in science fiction is like that. Some just like, hey, a good military adventure or whatever. But there's a lot in science fiction that really is philosophical in inspiration, and they're like, oh, finally a philosopher who like
Yeah,
understands and appreciates it,
yeah,
right? And there
yeah.
are a lot of philosophers who are, you wouldn't necessarily know it from their professional profile, but who are science fiction fans.
Right, right.
And you start talking about Star Trek with them, or Kim Stanley Robinson, or Black Mirror, or whatever, right? And they're like, oh yeah. So I think there's a lot of under the surface interest
Yeah.
among these communities and connecting with each other.
Yeah, yeah. I think that that's probably right. Um, so where do you hope that your work in this intersection will go from here on now? Do you have any new projects in this kind of bridge building going on?
Well, we do. So Helen DeCruz and science fiction editor Rich Horton and I have a new anthology under contract right now. We haven't yet chosen all the stories for it. We have a bunch of previously published stories, and the working title, which I still like, but the press isn't so enthusiastic about, so we might have to leave it, is Best Philosophical Science Fiction in the History of All Earth. And which is, of course,
Awesome.
ridiculously ambitious. But our idea is to try to live up to that ridiculous
Wow.
ambition, right? And have great philosophical stories from deep in multiple cultural traditions and bring them together
Wow.
into a single anthology.
Wow, that's great. Do you have a sense of when this projected work will be available?
So we're supposed to have chosen our list of stories by I think June, and then we'll need to do some editing and
Right.
getting the rights and all that. So we're looking probably uh, at late 2022 for release would be my guess. Maybe if we're lucky, mid 2022.
Wow,
So
great,
it's
great.
still kind of in the early phases, but we do have our plan worked out.
That's great. That's great. Well, Eric, I want to thank you for your time and sharing with us and letting us into a little bit of the insight into your book and the ways in which we can sort of think about this intersection between philosophy and science fiction. Much success on the book. I'm really looking forward to getting my own copy and looking at it. And I hope that perhaps we can continue talking about ways in which we can build this field up in a variety of ways in our professional philosophy world and maybe even in the science fiction world a little bit. So much success and congratulations on getting this out there.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been fun to chat.
No, thanks. And thank you for sharing your time with us today. If you have any questions, you can reach us on social media. We're the Anarres Project at Anarres Project on Instagram, on Facebook, and on Twitter. You can also find us at our website, which is anaresproject.org. Please go ahead and leave us a comment down below or subscribe to some of our other video sets. We look forward to hearing from you and seeing what you think about the ways in which science fiction can help us to understand our world in a better way. Thanks once again, Eric. We'll see you very soon.
Thanks.